So, good morning, everybody. This is such a wonderful community, and I was so excited when I came in that I realized I knew even more people than I had already gotten to know through the Faculty Workload and Rewards Project. I was here, I think, about a year and a half ago to talk about academic reward systems and community-engaged scholarship. So I got to connect with some folks there. And then it just so happens when you live down the road, you know folks from church and schools and communities. And there's just such a warm energy here. That's just obvious that people were very happy to see each other when they came in, even though it's a Monday morning, or excuse me, it's a Wednesday morning, not a Monday morning, right? When we've all got a lot going on. So one of the things that I would say, well, first of all, I want to thank Vice Provost Maggie Reitz and Provost Chandler, and of course, Madam President, which I love saying, as the director of our advanced project, to have women in presidential roles across the country and to have that here is just a phenomenal thing. For the invitation to be here at your January conference today. In addition to the things that were said previously, I would just add that I'm sure many of you, one of those people who carries in too many grocery bags. So, you see you've got about 12 grocery bags. You think, can I make 4 or 5 in with this trip, or maybe 8 or 9? If I put them on every finger and I sort of have one under my, and we all do that, and there's times we can't, we have to compartmentalize and set things aside. But I like thinking about how we work. I think we all find a lot of motivation and energy and meaningfulness in our work. So thinking about ways in which we can structure it to accomplish even more, I think is a good thing, particularly in January when we need a little energy to get kick-started again. So I think that Towson is an ideal place to ponder synergy between teaching, research, and community engagement, because this kind of balancing act is a strength and a necessity of large, metropolitan, comprehensive institutions. So when thinking about my own email, which I often complain about on a regular basis, I can't help but think about the Woody Allen quote, which perhaps for some seems apropos as well in our times. More than any other time in history, mankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray that we have the wisdom to choose correctly. I use that in jest just to say that sometimes getting to the bottom of your email list with all the various things that we have to do can feel impossible and frustrating. And I think in part it's because it's an example of how things come in separately. And we sort of, for a variety of systems and organizational reasons that we've actually put in place, separate them, when in fact maybe there are more ways that we can combine them. So some of the things I'd like us to think about that I've prepared some remarks on relate to faculty work often presenting as a zero-sum game. Time spent on one activity means less time for another. Finding synergies between seemingly distinct tasks can be hard, but it's critical in current context because we have too many meaningful things we want to do. And integration of activities and organizational flexibility can support such new possibilities. And when I mention current context, I think we all realize we face a lot of them. We've had states and the federal government reduce funding to higher education, and there's pressure to not raise college tuition. I was just listening to NPR on the way here, and there was discussion of that, of course, in the state of Maryland, not keeping college affordable. Which means many institutions have to find ways to diversify their funding sources. So not only tuition, but also outreach funds, continuing education, foundation, more in alumni donors, a greater share of research funds, but diversification because of the inability to raise tuition for very good reasons. We face greater accountability for access, retention, time to degree, and career placement than perhaps ever before. And as the demographics of our student bodies have changed, there's a need for culturally competent and responsive teaching techniques. There's also administrative creep. Technology has saved time, but also shifted additional tasks to faculty plates. And yet, it's not like we enter this process with a reserve of a significant amount of time that faculty just have sitting there to give to these new challenges. Our faculty on most national surveys report working somewhere between 54 and 60 hours a week, at least during a 9-month contract. There's more dual career households balancing work and family than ever before. Faculty lack time for new initiatives because of high course loads, increasing enrollments in some majors, and there's ratcheting up of expectations such that many assistant professors would reflect that they hear that the requirements for tenure are higher now than they were even 5 to 7 years ago. And so many faculty experience these sort of what comes in to their inboxes as competing priorities, right? There's the socialization in the field in terms of the kinds of things, and I'm actually teaching right now in the winter term a course on ranking systems, so I always have ranking systems in my head. Bob Morse, who created the U.S. News and World Report, dreaded U.S. News and World Report rankings, is one of the speakers in our course, as well as Ellen Hazelcorn, who is a world expert on the world rankings, and we've got Washington Monthly coming, and thinking about what do these various ranking systems hold as the things that they're going to give you points for, versus what are the high impact practices wonderful pedagogical research has shown, and I'm sure research here has shown really work in terms of advancing students. And unfortunately, these kinds of things can be experienced in competition. And so what that means is many faculty right now in higher education experience life in a sort of in-between place. I've done a lot of interviews with faculty, read a lot of read all the national surveys, been involved in a lot of projects with departments and colleges, and talked to faculty on a variety of different campuses. And I'm hearing this from faculty from multiple perspectives in multiple kinds of ways. This in-between place is, I like the movies, in addition to The Lord of the Rings. I like Apollo 13. I think it's an interesting movie to think about an in-between place. Because much like the story of Apollo 13, where the crew found themselves in a place they had never been before, a place of loss and challenge. They lost the moon. And a challenge is they needed to figure out how to get home with different equipment than they thought they were going to have. Many of our departments feel this in-between place today in how colleagues talk about what real work is in our department. In transitions of retirements, as people who built programs are now transitioning into phased retirement or other roles. And we're bringing in new hires, but it's not clear what the priorities will be for those new hires, what balance of teaching and research. There's also the invasion of work life into home life, feeling like we're constantly being asked to jump on another bandwagon when sometimes leadership shifts occur, and trying to find ways to stay on a course that'll be meaningful to us, that we know our best talents are set in that course. So much like Apollo 13, where astronauts had to improvise, using what they had to create new tools to get home, faculty find they need new strategies. And so one of those strategies is integration. Another is organizational flexibility in response to the desire to integrate tasks. In other words, many of the kinds of connections that would be made between those 3 tasks that we started off with on the to-do list would require some shared agreements between department chairs and the institution to remove some of the obstacles to putting those 3 things together. It requires conversations within departments about curricular planning. It requires being light on our feet about what we've always done and rethinking it about what we want to do going forward. And that kind of thing is fueled by examples. So one of the things that I want to think about are the things we need in order to make the integration that we would find useful. And in some ways, we want to compartmentalize. There are reasons why aspects of our research really don't work with the work we're doing in an undergraduate research class, and they need to be separate. But there are also things that can be more ably combined if we had organizational support and resources and examples to do those things. And so what I think we want to think about in the image of a zero-sum game to a non-zero-sum game is, again, some things in a zero-sum game, all things are competitive, right? Research is always at odds with time for teaching. One strategy is preferable to all others, whether that be the messages coming from our disciplinary associations or from our institution or from students. And each one that's pulling at you has different competing interests. Non-zero-sum games, though, of course, again, still have some things that are compartmentalized, but there's no single optimal strategy that's preferable to all others, and there are things that can be combined and be complementary. Now, we wouldn't want to be naive and say that this is easy, right? So when we dig into the research, and actually I'm eager for some of the sources that I have here to be replicated. I realize those are a little dated, and I have seen some things, some studies that have been done in the last 3 or 4 years on this, but I liked these studies better. That's why I cited them. I think the same statistics would hold true in more recent studies in most sectors. When you dig into the research, you find that both disciplinary research and effective teaching, of course, take considerable time and effort. And researchers have found that few institutions in the group of institutions, and particularly among 4-years, are able to accomplish both even moderately well. And by that, they're defining a certain level of performance in research by publishing or grants or scholarship, performance, if you're in a school of performance. So they're using all definitions of research and scholarship. And by teaching effectiveness, they're talking about students, being retained, them graduating. They're talking about high impact practices. They're trying to use measures of those two things. And they're saying that when they look at the faculty in most institutions, they find they kind of balance, they kind of more often are emphasizing one or the other, that it is very hard to find this balance. And the institutions that are able to do it are actually finding that what they need to do are they integrate, they synthesize, they layer teaching, research, and engagement activities together. They also invest constantly in professional development and talent development, but not just for faculty, for students as well. And they think of them in synergistic ways. So these are the things that institutions that are trying to make it less of a weighted system where your faculty are mostly emphasizing research and phoning in teaching, or they're mostly able to do great teaching, but not able to get to sort of spend as much time on research or make some of the scholarly contributions that they want to make. They're finding that they're investing in professional development and collaboration, and they're integrating these different kinds of activities. They're also doing something that Lorleen Hoyt calls finding instruments for action. And that is, they're re-looking at what we might call some of the structures that we created. The 3-credit class, of course, has been around for a long time, but some of the other structures, our master's capstone, a living learning community with linked classes, internships, undergraduate research credits, labs. And they're looking at them and they're saying, we've always done it this way, and kind of because we're so busy, not rethought how it could be done differently, or thought about any kind of softness on the edges about how we might do that differently to meet different purposes. And so these are 3 things that institutions are doing to try to integrate and to sort of bring in more grocery bags, I guess you would say. One particular area, though, that I'd like to focus on, both because I've studied it and also because that I know it's something that Towson has worked hard to advance and is sort of part of your DNA, is community engagement and the integration of community engagement with teaching and research. So as you know, from national surveys such as UCLA's Harris survey, we've seen a significant uptake in faculty involvement in community engagement. So what you see here is that there's been an increase in faculty community engagement for all groups, but especially for junior faculty, for public institutions, for women and underrepresented minority faculty. And the thing that's wonderful about community engagement is it addresses two challenges at once: improving teaching and learning, and also responding to different learning styles and student demographics. One of the things I'm going to mention in a minute, though, is that it also provides unique opportunities for scholarship that don't exist by many of the means in which we've done scholarship before. One of the things I find most exciting about community engagement is the way in which you see teachers open up students' minds to grand challenges. There was a survey item that UCLA did for many years when they first started their survey, the Astons first started their survey, that was, to what degree are you coming to college in order to pursue a meaningful philosophy of life? And now, could you imagine asking that question? It would be, I'm getting a job, right? I'm clearly coming for a credential. It's part of a rite of passage. I am trying to graduate into a job. But the thing that I think is really interesting is that, so I went to Loyola down the street, and I really felt like one of the things my professors were doing, and I know from having met many of you that is exciting to you about being a teacher and a mentor, is that you're trying to do more than, of course you want to help them learn and to graduate into great jobs and to build lives that way. But we also are trying to introduce them to all of the challenges that exist in our fields. The big project that they can work on, that they can contribute to, whether that be a scientific issue, whether that be a public policy issue, income inequality, cyberbullying, childhood obesity, achievement gaps, growing small businesses and economies that are more globalized. All of these things, if we can open students' minds and passion and hearts to the idea that they themselves, through what they study and what they do in terms of vocation, can make a unique stamp and imprint in those things. I mean, what better job is there, right, than to introduce them to grand challenges? The term grand challenges, of course, came from the bill, was used more often in the 1980s to set USA policy goals with regard to compelling computing and communication styles. But it's also been picked up by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They committed $100 million to encourage scientists, to fight our greatest health challenges. The National Academy of Engineering adopted a set of 12 grand challenges, such as providing access to clean water, restoring and improving urban infrastructure. But again, all these kinds of grand challenges exist in all of our fields, and many people find that community engagement is a way to pull students into those grand challenges in a very exciting way. It's also a way to see research and the way in which our research can make an impact in the world in a very distinct way. So in fact, faculty who I've interviewed who've talked about why they're involved in the integration of their teaching and their research with community engagement, they talk about the expanded professional networks. If you're in education and you get a chance to be involved in community engagement with, let's say, the Baltimore schools or schools here in Towson, you're learning about issues in the field that you're bringing back to your classroom, of course. Learning in scholarship and disciplines and within fields, it can find ways to contribute back into what you're writing in journals. It also allows us a way to show how a particular field views a problem. So how does an anthropologist see this particular kind of issue happening in Baltimore or Towson or nearby? How does a political scientist view this kind of issue? So it gives you a real-life case study to help introduce people to disciplinary thinking. And it also helps develop civic-minded practices. So one of the things I wanted to do is provide 4 what I think are inspiring examples of this kind of work. The first one is Mary Alice Morgan, professor of English and Women's Studies, and Dr. Andrew Silver of Mercer University. So these professors worked with college students to study and impact a local issue, the rise of illicit massage parlors and sex trafficking in Macon, Georgia. Freshman seminar students had noticed the increase in billboard advertisements in the area for massage parlors and questioned whether women might be trafficked. In collaboration with a local rape crisis center and battered women's center and a refugee organization, they informed police and lobbied the mayor's office to take action. Their research led to raids and 2 trafficked women being freed. Upper-class women's studies students also organized a national conference to raise awareness about trafficking. Massage parlors flourished in Macon because there were no effective vice ordinances. Students helped research effective statutes in other cities, successfully lobbied the mayor and city attorney to institute similar ordinances in Macon, which led to over a dozen massage parlors being shut down. The research and engaged scholarship from this project was published in several journals, and of course it received a number of awards. A second example comes from engineering. Dr. Ha-Vinh Vo, also of Mercer University. And by the way, each time I go talk at an institution, I try to collect an example or 2. So please raise your hand afterwards and let me know which person I can highlight the next time that I go talk about community engagement at another institution, because I was at many of these places recently. So today in Vietnam, there remain thousands of people who lost limbs to leftover landmines during the Vietnam War. Many such individuals are poor and live in rural areas where it's next to impossible to access quality prosthetic legs. both because of cost and geography. So biomedical engineering students and their professor invented a low-cost prosthetic leg that's been patented and deployed in Vietnam and Haiti. More than 4,000 amputees were fitted and are now walking. It's endorsed by the government of Vietnam, and the Mercer program is being expanded throughout the country. The prosthetic can currently be manufactured at a cost of $200 compared to other prosthetics that had cost as much as $10,000. They're lightweight, inexpensive, and now have a patented universal socket made of Velcro that makes them easier to adjust in the field. And one of the things that the project leaders talked about, interestingly, was that the way that students, some of the students who are involved in the materials science of this, many of us grew up with sneakers. If you have kids that still wear sneakers that quickly use Velcro before they've learned how to tie their shoelaces, having multiple generations of people looking at a problem can sometimes really make a difference. And so students had a lot to do with the creation of this. I want to highlight Dr. Stephen Thomas, a good colleague and friend of mine at the Center for Health Equity at Maryland. So of course, researchers have found implicit bias impacts how doctors, nurses, and first responders hear symptoms raised by patients. And this can disadvantage women in comparison to men, African-American patients as opposed to white, who are talking about symptoms of heart attacks. Their different treatments can be offered based on how folks are presenting what's happening to them and how people are hearing their symptoms. So Stephen Thomas and colleagues developed a curriculum that could be used with health professionals to increase awareness of bias and reduce the likelihood bias gets in the way of appropriate diagnosis. This work's been commended by major health organizations. The curriculum was adopted by a number of hospitals to train future and health professionals, and as well as shared both in presentations and in some publications. I want to share Joanna Morrissey, assistant professor of kinesiology at Cal State Monterey Bay, who collaborated with a community partner to address the issue of childhood obesity by exposing elementary students to fun physical activities and healthy dietary changes. Kinesiology students engaged in service learning with fourth grade students and studied it along with their professor, resulting in the publications seen here as well as numerous awards. I also want to provide an example of what might be considered scholarship of teaching and learning work. So this is an example from Wright State University, and I've seen Dean Kleinbell present on the award-winning project that they worked on to sort of change the sequence of courses. When he talks about it, it's very compelling. He talked about the fact that one of the reasons they realized after they studied while they were having so much attrition in engineering majors was the order of the courses. So folks were coming in, they had the same GPA and SATs, but in those first 3 math courses that were not tied in any way to engineering, folks were losing interest in the major because they weren't getting in on those courses. They found a way to change and reform the curriculum so they could get the engineering pieces into the math courses so the students could see the relevance of the math they were doing more quickly, and it sort of pulled them along so that they could get through those hard math classes but stay engaged in the major. And of course, this work has received many NSF grants and been replicated in many different places and been published in a number of both disciplinary as well as teaching and learning scholarship journals. I really like this example I was sharing earlier with a colleague here because I think that places like Towson University certainly, but also similar type institutions have really figured out so many teaching and learning issues and issues of supporting and retaining and advancing students from various groups that the rest of the higher ed sector doesn't know as much about, that needs to be presented and highlighted and given more recognition. And this is an example of a way in which they figured something out that had replication ability in other places, and is a great example of integration, because it certainly involved a scholarship of teaching and learning to study and understand the issue, understand best practice, and then to share it. So when you look at these examples, one of the things you see, again, I'm going to go back to Woody Allen. Some drink deeply from the river of knowledge, others only gargle. Mm-hmm. So these faculty drink deep from many reservoirs of knowledge, and it benefits communities, students, and knowledge in their fields. But these efforts all required reflection. You don't just go and, and planning and institutional support. You don't just go and oh, let's just revamp those 3 courses, right? It required a lot of organizational support, a lot of flexibility in thinking. It also often involves negotiating multiple contexts and roles. One of the examples I didn't use was a professor at University of Vermont who takes a group each winter to study issues of disease transmission in several parts of Africa. And one of the things that he does is he brings graduate students who are TAing this course where they're doing data collection with community partners in various villages. And the amount of, complexity in that to both be mentoring at multiple levels, to be trying to collect actual data that can go back into sort of like in a lab setting, but in this case in a field setting, and also to be managing different languages, rules of different countries. It's complex work. It takes time and planning and a lot of support. But it also, in all these cases, allowed faculty in a really amazing way to introduce their students and pull them into a grand challenge where they clearly figured out they could carve out a place that they could make a difference. And this issue of organizational support is an important one. So I want to provide a couple examples that I think are interesting of that. So at the College of New Jersey, they had this teaching versus research balance. And one of the things that they decided to do years ago was to reduce the number of courses that faculty taught from 4 to 3, to increase the number of working hours by 6 hours available for faculty to devote to research. But what they did is they increased the number of credits for the courses. And some majors have, I know within departments, taken such an approach. Because what they were trying to do is get more undergraduates involved in research with faculty within a smaller number of, so the 4 credits, the additional credit that was added, provided a research component to the class. So technically faculty were preparing for less classes and spending less time in classes, and getting more time to do their research, but they were also better preparing their undergrads for graduate education, which was a desire that they had, as to many of their students wanted to go into master's programs afterwards. Another interesting example are experiments that are going on within departments about workload and ways in which you can combine things and count them in different ways. So Valparaiso was just in AAC&U's journal or newsletter, I guess, about their model where they're trying to create a flexible, sort of like a team-based system, wherein everybody on average is supposed to complete a certain number of credits, but based on career stage, somebody's preparing for tenure and needs to focus more on research, somebody has a sabbatical, they're able to provide some flexibility and shifting by group consensus within that scheme. And also, they are able to say, okay, you have to do these additional 6 credits. Many of us have that with our advising, advising credits or independent studies make up some additional credits that we do to, say, respond to the university's workload report, right? They're able to say, okay, these kinds of really important campus service or really important advising or work with living learning communities will count as part of these credits in a new way. And this is done by mutual administration faculty shared agreements. But it provides a way that faculty have said they found more of the work that they're doing that's important to their department and university is visible and not counted. But it's also a way the department is working together to integrate things and accomplish more things. The last organizational example I'd like to give is just a group of faculty that collectively realized that they wanted more time for writing. That's how it started, and created a faculty writing group so that many of the teaching and service activities that they were doing they wanted to move into the realm of scholarship, they would carve out time for. And this is at UNC Asheville that found a way to create a sharing of, and this group morphed into a way to share and do some collaborative interdisciplinary grant proposals, collaborative writing, as well as just carving out time to write about some of the important teaching and service innovations that folks were doing. So these are some of the examples that I wanted to provide of ways in which individuals are finding possibilities to integrate activities, and organizations are finding ways to support them. Yeah, there were a number of items on there about recognition that might be relevant for for the group that's looking at your promotion and tenure guidelines. For example, one of the things that is often used in science fields is, or in situations where somebody's having a lab, creating a lab when they come in as a faculty member, is there'll be an MOU developed that says, okay, this is the amount you'll get for your lab, and these are the resources, and et cetera. But they're also increasingly being used for people doing an interdisciplinary and engaged work, to note that this is going to be a focus of your work, so you're likely to publish in these kinds of journals, not only the typical ones that folks in your department use. And that can give a little bit of support, from the sense that you're not going to be trying to publish in places that won't make it won't count when you go up. But this time issue is an issue, is absolutely a crunch issue. Now, one of the great things is I know you have a number of administrators here who I want to invite any of them who want to talk about, or others who want to say anything about ways in which you've found flexibility, perhaps, to do various things that might help that issue, or things you might imagine, or committees that are talking about that. Compare it, though, to other challenges we have in our traditional kinds of scholarship and work. So the kinds of things that we might find in working with a city, let's say the politics change and it's a new mayor, like you were pointing out, ordinances and these things, provide a sort of a stall, or an inability to get things started the way we want. Certainly there have been issues in K through 12 schools where some schools have been burned before and won't work with researchers. These are definitely complex problems with community engagement. But it's also true that we face some of these things with traditional kinds of projects. So, for example, you are in a lab, you study fish, and there was ice, and unfortunately the tanks didn't work and the fish die. Terrible thing that happened, and now it's stopped your research project. Or you're supposed to go abroad to do that work in Galapagos. You're supposed to go abroad, and for some reason the visa didn't work, and you can't go do that kind of thing. So I like to sort of think about some of these projects and think, okay, we're going to need resilience for all of the various contingencies that happen. Is there anything we could do about the way we're organized that could help us be more resilient or light on our feet when that happens? Similar to the way that our institutions are having to be light on their feet about diversifying our funding sources, or revising our majors based on the needs of our students that come in. And Towson and other places have been doing that in many ways as well. But I think I'm hearing that figuring out a way to either build the recognition of the longer period of time into reward systems, so that there's recognition that these things take longer, just like if your lab had a terrible thing happen, that would be recognized and perhaps give you an extra year on the tenure clock. That's happened. Or ways in which, things people can be given time for planning, right? Time to plan a sequence of courses, time to, and that is resources. So those are things, but you've got a number of department chairs in the room. You've got your leadership behind you, so hopefully this can continue to be a conversation that folks that are fueling the various offices that are supporting this can continue to have with faculty here. I had a couple last thoughts that I wanted to share, and then I know we need to wrap up because you've planned excellent sessions in rooms for the rest of the day that Maggie will lead you to. I mentioned I've done a lot of interviews with faculty that have integrated various roles, and some of its organizational psych, organizational behavior, work management literature talks about the fact that the following things enhance people's sense of agency in integrating tasks. The first one is containing attention, just finding time for planning. A number of the projects I'm involved in right now as a faculty member are highly integrated, but only after 6 months, or it was in my head for 3 years before I figured out how I could finally make the grant, mentor the student, be working and doing something to actually impact practice, but I could maybe publish it and make those things that were, very disparate things. There's no way you can just wake up and everything's perfectly integrated. So time for planning and building that into our structures is really important. Concrete examples, that's why that was on the list. The more that we can get syllabi of engaged classes from colleagues that have done this before, or examples of MOUs that people negotiated so that their work in an area could count, or promotion and tenure guidelines from similar institutions with the kind of commitment that Towson has, so that you can put similar kinds of language for interdisciplinary and engaged work into your promotion and tenure guidelines. Examples, examples, examples. When we do career development things at Maryland, one of the first things we do is give people copies of others' personal statements. Just because, not because theirs is going to be the same, but they just understand the ways in which they feel more efficacy about writing their own when they see the form that these are taking. Encouraging peer support. So most of the kinds of ideas that will work here, you could find within this room, right? They don't have to be necessarily taken all from outside. Many folks here have done some of the things you might want to do. So reaching out and getting that peer support. I mentioned one of my favorite lines from The Lord of the Rings is, "Hope remains while the company is true." So I think you've got some true company in the room, and reaching out to talk to each other about ways in which you could help each other do some of these things really makes a lot of sense. And then suspending disbelief, that maybe I have to separate all of these things. It's not going to be possible. Our students are not yet up to this level, in which some cases that'll be true. In some cases, the fact that you could find a few students to pilot it with. So sort of suspending disbelief that it's not possible to just try out whether or not some of these things might work. So there's no doubt that there's going to be some zero-sum games where we need to focus on one activity, and that means less time for another. But many of the structures we work with every day are surprisingly of our own making. And by that I mean faculty's making. Not all of them. There's workload reports that we send to the legislature. There are things that are there for financial reasons. But there are a lot of things we made and we can reform and unmake if we work together. And there may be new ways to think of our research, our courses, our advising that allow us to integrate them to form instruments of action, to leverage multiple goals simultaneously. And recognition, resources, flexibility, and how we organize, as well as a little help from true company, can make us even more effective in doing the work that matters most. Thank you very much for the time with you today.